Good evening and welcome to the Hamilton Report. I'm Scott J. Hamilton, the Executive Director of the Oklahoma Democratic Party, and I am pleased that you are with us this evening. Before we get started with tonight's show, I just want to take a moment to say thank you to Kaylin Free and Governor David Walters, our committee man and woman with the DNC, and also to Joshua Harris Till, who is the president of Young Democrats of America, for joining me on the program last week. If you missed it, I encourage you to go back and check it out. They're all available on YouTube, and I hope that you will take a moment to look at those. And I'm delighted that you're here with us this evening. We had a great convention last week, and tonight kicks off the Republican National Convention. And so it's only appropriate that we begin this week talking about law and order. And certainly that's a topic that's going to come up a lot this week. But I'm very, very pleased to welcome as our guest this evening a man whom I have admired for many, many years. We met almost 20 years ago. And from the first time I met him, I saw the good that he was doing for people as a policeman. And I was just standing in amazement and watching his career take off at a meteoric pace. Because when I met him, he was Captain Phillip Banks, and it's my pleasure to introduce you tonight to Chief of Department Phillip Banks. He is retired from the Nypd and an absolute gift when it comes to policing and knowledge of policing, especially in terms of policing in mixed or minority communities. So with that, I'm very, very happy to welcome to our program this evening Chief Banks. I am so glad that you're with us. Welcome.
Thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure. Good to hear from you. Like you said, it's been a very long time, and I'm glad that you're doing well. I see you're still doing God's work, and I appreciate the opportunity to come in and learn and talk with you and your audience.
Well, I appreciate that. There are a lot of Republicans in Oklahoma that would say that this is probably not God's work. But I'll accept that compliment because that's what we try to make it every day. When we met, it was in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, Bedford-Stuyvesant, and I had moved there from. I'd moved to Bed-Stuy from Washington Heights, and before that, we had lived in Stapleton on Staten Island, all areas with pretty substantial crime. And one of the things that I noticed as soon as we moved to Bed-Stuy was the way that police officers interacted with members of the community. And that was something that caught my attention early on. As a matter of fact, one of the first people that we met under your command was Sergeant Tony Caggiano. And I was sorry to see that Tony passed away recently of COVID right after he retired. But that was our introduction to your command. And I'd like for you to talk a little bit, if you would, this evening about what approach you took to engaging the department and the community and the community and the department. It looks like we may be having some technical issues here. I'm afraid that Chief Banks is frozen, and things were working very well before we came on the air this evening. So I'm going to give him a moment to try to re-enter the studio. And while we're doing that, I will say that community policing is something that people have really embraced in many communities, while other communities have felt that it was not sufficient for the community, that in fact it put people in harm's way. My own experience in living in communities where community policing was greatly underscored in policing and in community life was that it made a positive impact on the community. It allowed older people to be involved in a meaningful way with their community, and also young people as well. So there were many upsides that we found to living in a community where there was a strong police presence. Now, I'm glad to see that you're back with us now. Um, what I was saying in your absence was that I felt very strongly that the relationship between police and the community in Bed-Stuy was a powerful force in making life better for everyone who lived in the community. And I'd like for you to talk a little bit about your experience with community policing and how you made it work for your command and for the community.
Well, I don't know if you ever make it work, Scott. I think you can just do the best you can and give it the best effort that you can. What was what I believed in, right? I believe in people, and that sounds corny. People say you take the job, you're a police officer, you say you believe in people, but it never was about community policing for me. It was never a program for me. It was never a necessarily a philosophy for me. This was just the way that you were supposed to conduct business. These were people in the community. And from the first time I came on the job, it was very clear to me. I mean, prior to coming on the job, that it's such an enormous task, public safety. It cannot be done just by policing. It has to be done as pure partners, and not the partnership that I say you do, but the partnership is, how do you feel about your community? What would you do if you were in charge? What do you want to see in your police officers, in your police community? And then I just try to implement that because I understand that relationships mean a lot. And once you actually learn the community and the community learns you, it's just, I see the magic of what can be accomplished. And now when I see all of the turmoil that law enforcement is going through, it saddens me to a great degree because it's such a missed opportunity on both ends, but primarily in a law enforcement perspective, on what can be done if you just get rid of old habits and habits that don't work, and having the ability to say that I was wrong yesterday and I'm going to be a little more righter. I don't know if that's a word, a little more righter today. And when that's your way of life, it really becomes very easy. Now, granted, I thought the people in Bedford Stuyvesant were like the salt of the earth. So it was very easy for me to be able to adapt the style that I tried to utilize in policing in Bedford Stuyvesant. They're still very dear to my heart. And it was just a glimpse that if we just nationwide just adopted these particular stances, where we could go, where we should be.
It's no secret that I am a fan of the police. It's also no secret that I have attended many Black Lives Matter um, marches and demonstrations over the last few years. You are not only a retired chief, but you're also a dad. And tell me what it's like for you as a father, what it's been like, because you really have, I won't say walked through the middle, but you've been able to see both sides clearly, that of the police and your own family.
You know, my father was a police officer. I mean, he spent many years in the New York City Police Department, and he had three boys. And we were all close in age. We were all within 3 years of each other. So we were experiencing just the elements of the streets. And my father worked in most of his career, he did in Brownsville, right, in the 73rd Precinct. And he would have many, many talks, right? Partly, right, because he said we were hard headed, but two, he wanted it to resonate about the dangers that you face when dealing with the police. Now, the flip side of that, he made it very clear, and this is something he didn't have to say, but he said, he made it very clear that when we were in the street, we were to act like we had parents. He made it very clear about having the respect for the police, right? About not trying to met out street justice if you think the police officers are right or wrong. But certainly, he took us through the drills of if you were approached by the police, if you were pulled over by that particular police. And I adopted those same type of philosophy and speaking with my children. It used to be very clear. I used to say the overwhelming majority of police officers are very good. And I don't know what that actually means, right? Because that only means something if law enforcement is spending due diligent time trying to rid the percentage that aren't good. And we use that. There's only a few bad cops, but few bad cops. It's only a few billionaires in the world too, but they have a lot of money and a lot of influence. So on the
Yeah.
law enforcement side, it's not enough for us to say that. But what I used to tell my children, my sons all the time, police officers oftentimes are scared too. So help them, like help them become a better officer. And they went through the drill. Police officers pulling you over, the car windows are coming down. The music is coming off. There's no sudden movements. The hands are on the steering wheel. You don't move until that officer says something specific. You let him know. I had my youngest son. He always would have had to have his driver's license and his the registration and the dashboard because we wanted to be very clear that there were no sudden movements. And this is something that I went through consistently over and over with them. And then we had a drill when they were, in fact, being stopped if they were walked. And ultimately, you had to be very respectful. But two, you can and very likely will run against some police officers that do not want to do you right justice and are not going to perform their jobs properly. So we're going to help them. And then if we have to circle back to see what action we need to take to see how they can be held accountable, they do. But that's something that was very big because, you want your kids to return home safely at night.
Well, if I recall correctly, you were on holiday back home from college, and you and some friends got pulled over by the police on the block where you had grown up. And you said that two of them treated you with respect, but one did not. And clearly that made a lasting impression on you.
Scott, you remember that, huh?
I do.
You actually remember. I didn't mention that story to many people. Yeah, two did their job the way, in retrospect, the way they were trained to do it. And it was just one. And you find that oftentimes. But what happens is that one person, he corrupted the other three. So even though, in fact, they handled their jobs relatively professional, in my minds and in my two friends' minds, who I just hung up with one of them very interestingly, right?
Mm.
We were talking about it recently. Um, that one person has done the damage like it was 20 or 30 police officers. And that's something law enforcement has to understand. And we were coming back from college and they threw all of our clothes and we went back for a weekend to visit our alma mater and they threw all our clothes out and I was just showing them the back. And it may have been the one or two cops in the precinct who did that, but he left a mark, certainly on me and the other two officers. And that's in fact what happens. And that's something that the police, we have to get that right.
And whether it's fair or not, I think that as humans, we tend to judge with a broad brush. So one person we can think of as being indicative of an entire group, but that's not the right way to do it. But sadly, it is the way that it's often done. When we look at the police officers who have been in the news, particularly those who have mistreated and ultimately taken the lives of young Black men and women, it's what do you say to the public to get them past that place of saying all cops are bad people?
Scott, that was probably the most difficult part of my job because I felt as an industry, one of the things that we in law enforcement did very poorly was assess and discipline our own. The metrics that were in place were old metrics, and it would lead some to believe on the outside that it wasn't a priority to find out and to ascertain who those few bad apples, quote unquote, are. And it was very, very difficult because I never wanted to sound like I was a police officer. I wanted to sound like, because that's what starts the division. When you come across sounding like you're a cop and sounding like you're defending a system. When I wanted to defend something, I wanted to defend it because I believed in it, not because it was just a title or job that I had.
Mm.
And I did not believe in law enforcement, specifically the New York City Police Department, that we had a passing mark at identifying and rooting out those individuals who were not carrying themselves in the manner in which they were trained and what their expectations were. So, and I would make that very known, and I would not deny it, and no stretch of the imagination. And I would say then, as I say now, it is probably the biggest failure law enforcement has, and It's very unfortunate because all of the good work that's done by the men and women who wear uniforms in this country, it's having your air conditioner on and having the windows open. And all we do is lift the windows open, lift the windows open. And until we understand that the enemy is not the activists and the protesters and the quote unquote left wing or right wing, it's those officers who do not deserve to wear the shield, and they have the greatest area of protection, which is the agency themselves. And that's something that we have to get right, or else we will never be able to achieve the success that we deserve.
Before we look at next steps in policing, I'd like to just take notice of the fact that the FBI reported a significant downturn in violent crime, 16% down in a 9-year period from 2005 to 2014. What, and you were certainly very, very involved in policing, not just at the precinct level, but certainly at the department level by the end of this study. What do you attribute at least part of that significant downturn to?
Two things. One, and this was the second thing, is that we got smarter and very strategic about fighting crime. And two, we started building some trust with the community, and they deserve a lot of credit on helping reduce this crime. Those are the ones that were telling us who the bad guys and the bad girls was in the neighborhood. Those are the ones who were coming forth and going to the district attorney and testifying, right? Those are the ones that was listening, that community, to our crime prevention tips and minimizing themselves being a victim. And we only scratched the surface with that particular relationship. But law enforcement, we got smarter and we got a little more strategic about how we were going to dissect this particular crime and take it down. So they certainly deserve a pat on the back. But actually, the relationship with the community and the synergy that was evolved from that is absolutely 100% the driving force behind that crime reduction.
And I'm glad you said that, because that leads me to another point I want to look at. Neither you nor I were old enough to be actively remembering 1977's New York City blackout. I was a teenager. You weren't quite, but the
no, I think I was 15 years of age when that okay, so.
But the it's been well documented, all of the looting, the violent crime that occurred during that blackout. In 2003, I was in Brooklyn, in Bed-Stuy, and there was not one major crime reported anywhere in New York City during that blackout. And that has to be attributed in part to the partnership between community and police, don't you think?
Absolutely. You know, when you change the culture, if you have a society when you change the culture, you don't actually need as many cops as we have in this particular country. And now be clear, I'm not saying that we need to reduce the policing, because I'm not so sure about that. But when you change the culture of people, right, and then and start really strengthening those relationships, you can draw the parallels between the two. 1977 was a bad time in New York City, and 2003 was a significant attributed to the relationship. And I hate to say the police in the community. I like to use because in a utopian sense, we're all supposed to be one. You know, so public safety is not the responsibility of law enforcement. Public safety is the responsibility of everybody who's involved. So when you just draw on those particular relationships there, and I think that's a great parallel that you brought up between the differences between the two. We just hope that in the next blackout, that it's a blackout of 2003 and not 1997, and we shouldn't be guessing. We should be strategically, moving to having and strengthening that culture so that it doesn't happen.
Well, let's move beyond big city for a moment, because most of the country does not live in a major metropolitan area. Do you see changes that are occurring, or better yet, point, if you would, to changes that you think need to occur in smaller policing? A city the size of Oklahoma City, 600,000 people, for example, or all the way down to really small communities?
The big umbrella is okay. I'm not sure if you're still there, Scott.
Yeah, I can still hear you.
Are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Okay, hello? Okay. I can hear you now. I can hear you fine now. This is something that law enforcement cannot get away from, right? Cannot get away from. Is that you have to develop trust. Interestingly, I had a conversation with the Baltimore Police Commissioner. I'm going back a few years. I won't mention any names. And he talked about the great relationship that his department had with the community. And he was fired a week later. And there was no uprising from the community to support him. A few months later, I went to Chicago and was having a conversation with the superintendent of the Chicago police. And he, in fact, spoke about this great relationship that his department formed with the community. And he was fired within a few days. And there was no uproar about bringing him back or why was he fired. And what I use that point to say, to whether you're in a big police department and a small police department, and I say this to my former peers in law enforcement, do not kid yourself about the relationship with the, develop those metrics, change them, alter them, modify them to determine, in fact, do you have that community or do you have a great relationship with people who have consistently been friends of the police, right? No one else. And until you develop those metrics, whether Wisconsin, whether you're in Houston, whether you're in New York City, whether you're in Iowa, you can't fool people for a short period of time. Ultimately, they are going to be able to make the determination whether you are there to support them or oppress them. And I firmly believe that that's not law enforcement's nature. I just don't think that we spend enough time fact checking ourselves and our policies and the outcomes of our mission statement. And it's unfortunately. So those small town police departments, how does the community feel about you? And where are you deriving that information from? And I'm going to challenge that by and large, we're using outdated metrics. And we're at a point in time now that they're dangerous to use those type metrics.
Well, and I appreciate you saying that. What does America have a right to ask of policing in I'm talking about our very next steps toward healing some of the division between the police and certainly many different minority groups or marginalized folks? How do we collectively begin a dialogue that will start to make a positive impact on those relationships?
I think you have to start with one question to anybody who is actively in law enforcement now. How long would it take you to ascertain someone in your police department that would be acting differently than if the chief of police was standing right next to that person? So Scott Hamilton comes on the police department, and he is now working these particular communities, whether they're rural, whether they're suburban, whether they're in the city. How long would it take for you to determine that he is not performing his job, should performing, if you, chief, was standing next to him on every job? And until we, and I still default back to until we or law enforcement condition, they're ultimately, it leads to what we've seen in the last year in this particular country.
Well, clearly we have a great deal to accomplish if we are ever going to build communities up. I know I have seen the impact of working with police who truly care about the people who they are tasked with serving, with protecting. And I know that the outcomes there can be very, very good. And I'm not talking about just in terms of crime. I'm talking about quality of life in a neighborhood, in a community, where those relationships are strong. Now, you've told us what you would expect of police. What about of the community? What an average citizen? What can I do as just a citizen to help make for a stronger relationship with police in my community?
Scott, that's a big question because, when I used to go around to police departments and I used to speak to police departments, and also when I was the chief of the community affairs in the New York City Police around. And I used to say, if you look at any marriage, any relationship, and if there's problems in the relationship, there's fault to put on both sides, right? So it's never one person is 100% at fault, the other person is not. Unfortunately, in this law enforcement community relationship, law enforcement takes the heat, as they should take the majority of the heat, because they are paid and they're trained and there's expectations of them to be able to deliver and perform in certain manners. But the other side of the equation, why I think it's such a great question, is that there's a responsibility as well for people in the community to, in fact, your role in public safety. So what are they? One, I ask everybody, do you know the name of your local commander? So start with that. The first thing, do you know the name of your local commander, the person who's responsible for public safety in your area? Do you know his or her name? Do you have his or her number? Do you have his or her email? The first thing. The second thing that I would say is there a community council meeting or some type of gathering where you have the opportunity to listen firsthand about what's going on in your neighborhood? And if so, then you need to be able to make those meetings as much as you can, or have a representative from your block or your circle make those particular meetings. And the third thing, which is very important, is that anything that you see in your community, right, that is not up to snuff, whether or not it's loud music, whether or not it's litter, whether or not it's abandoned cars, it's abandoned homes, derelict vehicles, make sure that you have a responsibility to report that to appropriate agency. There's oftentimes when I would be met with rave of complaints, and we look and we've never had a complaint on it as well, right? So get involved, find out what the local commander is, find out if there's any particular meetings, and make sure that you try to make those meetings as much as you possibly can. And anything that looks suspicious in your particular neighborhood, develop a venue in which you can communicate that information, because it's much more helpful to law enforcement than I think the average person realizes.
We have clearly just begun to scratch the surface of this topic, and it's one we're going to need to revisit as society in the weeks and months ahead. I want to tell you how grateful I am to spend some time with us this evening, and my hope is that we can begin this conversation again and continue it after the elections, because you have a wealth of knowledge, and I, for one, am grateful that you spent some time in sharing it with us this evening.
It was really my pleasure. It's really good seeing you, and I wish you all the best. It was my pleasure. Anything for you.
Thank you so much. Well, our guest this evening has been NYPD Chief of Department Phillip Banks. He's retired now, but clearly his thinking on policing and community is very, very current, and I'm grateful that he was with us this evening. I'm also grateful that you were with us this evening, and before we say goodnight, I just need to make a personal appeal to you. We are in the election season of our lifetime, and we need your support. We need your financial support so that we can continue programs like this, training and working with candidates, and helping people understand what's at stake, not just for this election, but for every time we prepare to go to the polls. So we do need your contribution, and I hope that you will consider making a monthly contribution, and you can do it at okdemocrats.org/donate.
But first, you'll have to
You have
unlock your
been grateful. I'm grateful that you've decided to be with us this evening, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Until then, I'm Scott J. Hamilton for the Oklahoma Democratic Party, wishing you a good evening. Take good care of yourself and each other. Good night.